This week, we're going to start our cultural anthropology section of the course, and we're going to change things up a little bit from how, for example, the textbook's organized. And that is really an issue of my personal preference, and we'll talk for just a moment about why. Generally, when you look at textbooks that discuss cultural anthropology, you see things organized. Basically by topic headings or units, kind of like a thematic unit sort of thing, where you would, for example, find a chapter on ethnicity and race. You would find a chapter on religion, on families and kinship, etc. And I even used to teach my intro to anthropology courses that way, where we had like these thematic units, and then we went through and talked about kind of the variation that we see across populations. The reason I stopped doing this is because of a very important kind of pattern of relationship and kind of a conceptual reason. So, one of the things that cultural anthropology has given us is this knowledge that there are some human universals, right? That there are human universals that are based on biology. There are human universals that are based on cultural features, etc. And understanding kind of why certain human populations came up with their strategies or their solutions to adaptive problems can be really, really informative. And so what we're going to talk about are the way that we're going to deal with cultural anthropology. We are going to do it from the standpoint of adaptive strategies. We are going to look because the reason behind this is that there are two reasons why cultures may be incredibly similar. One of those is cultural phylogeny. This is where you've got basically like the same parent culture. So, why do we speak English in the United States? It's because of at one time being a British colony. Um, that explains cultural similarities based on kind of a cultural heritage or shared ancestral culture. That's not enough, though, because interestingly, as we look across human populations, we find some really big similarities that are based on something else that have nothing to do really with parent culture, and everything to do with how those cultures, how those societies make a living. And so that's how we're going to approach this last unit. We're going to look at the ways that we make a living or our adaptive strategies, and then talk about the cultural correlates, kind of the why other aspects of culture map onto that. So we will specifically ask, how do people make a living in different types of societies? We will find, for example, that most human societies, at least before modern times, dealt with the currency of calories, tracked their wealth and the distribution of wealth through the distribution of caloric resources or food. So, as a species, we have a very, very long, both biological and cultural heritage of food sharing. So, food is something that we should be pretty willing to share widely. Money, not so much. We don't have those same kind of innate tendencies to treat money as like a collective or a shared resource. We will talk about what defines an economy and specifically what different populations are economizing. You know, when you maximize profit, is that something that we are as a species predisposed to do? Are we profit maximizers or are we maximizing something else like social harmony or kind of the more equitable distribution of wealth? And then we'll talk about what principles regulate the exchange of goods and services in various societies, right? We are definitely a capitalist mode of exchanging, redistributing resources, in that we work to get a paycheck. We then take that paycheck and spend the money from it on the resources that we need. So we're using this intermediate currency of money, right? That's not true everywhere in the world that you go. So adaptive strategies can be stratified into two major kinds. The first, which we have, is the way that we as humans have existed for millions of years, arguably since the time of Homo erectus, is through foraging. Foraging populations rely on natural resources. Um, and foragers generally do not play an active role in the plant and animal reproduction of the species that they're utilizing. By contrast, we've got those societies that are based in food production. And so everything that we've talked about from the broad spectrum revolution on, right, that's hinting at these changes that came along with food production. And so we will talk about how food production and the advent of it fueled major changes in human life, fueled an entire change in these cultural correlates and the way that we define family and the way that we share resources, etc. Adaptive strategies are defined as the means of making a living or a society's production system. So when we talk about food production, for example, we will talk about several adaptive strategies that go hand in hand with this definition, but that is not the only way that human populations make a living. And so we will use Cohen's typology for defining what the major adaptive strategies are. And Cohen divided the world up into five main adaptive strategies. We will talk about the possibility of a sixth in just briefly. Those typologies that were enumerated by Cohen include foraging, horticulture, agriculture, pastoralism, and industrialism. We could argue that in a fully modern context, we have some human societies that have moved beyond industrialism to something that we would call post industrialism. And so, when we talk about industrialism, we talk about manufacturing goods that then you buy with money, right? We talk about kind of this massive scale of manufacturing of resources of goods. But when we talk about post industrialism, we're talking about an economy that is no longer based on the manufacturing of goods, but instead an economy that's based on ideas and also based on service. So when you think about the kind of work that people do now, right? Most of us are not working in manufacturing plants. Um, those companies that still manufacture goods often don't do so in places like the US anymore because of rules surrounding working conditions, because of laws surrounding minimum wage and such. And so most of the world's production now happens in developing countries and in this kind of context of large multinational corporations. So when you think about what people actually produce or do, right, my entire paycheck is based on transferring knowledge to you, right? I mean, that is the whole field of education. I'm not dealing in something tangible. I'm dealing in ideas and concepts. And, sometimes it blows my mind to just think about the fact that we have moved to a point in our society where, we don't touch money. We don't touch the resources that we would produce. We just have everything happen in this kind of amorphous virtual realm. And you believe that I have knowledge that justifies being paid for sharing my knowledge. And in the future, you may do something similar, though, in a wide variety of fields. I mean, it's just mind blowing when you think about it, right? That in terms of tangible production, we don't have very much stuff that you can touch and feel and hold that we produce. But we won't spend great amounts of time talking about post industrialism. This is where anthropology and sociology really start to kind of overlap, in that sociology has historically dealt much more with large Western contexts, right? With large Western cultural systems, and that is where we find these post-industrial societies. All right, so the most important reason for similarities between two or more unrelated societies is that they possess the same adaptive strategy, which is why we're going to broach our cultural anthropology unit by looking at adaptive strategies. So we'll start with foragers. Foragers we've been talking about really since we started talking about hominin evolution. Um, when we look at how humans have lived their lives for the vast amount of time that we've been alive as species, right? We have lived as foragers. We could argue that the first forager or active hunter gatherer, as we mentioned in our uh, human origins lectures, right, was Homo erectus. That we really have Homo erectus to thank for um, for our specialization as active hunters, right? So, foragers, all humans have lived as foragers until roughly about 10,000 years ago. It is really with the advent of the broad spectrum revolution and the emergence of cultivation, intentional control over the reproduction of plants and animals, that we start to deviate from our foraging traditions. Foragers rely on natural resources that follow natural patterns of uh, availability, seasonality, etc., where the humans themselves are not actively tending to those resources. That is, they're not watering, they're not transplanting. Instead, they will consume those resources when those resources are available, and they will move on and eat other naturally occurring resources at other times. With the spread of the modern world as a system, foraging is declining. We don't have very many extant foraging groups or hunter gatherer groups left in the world. We have two of them pictured here, though. At the top, we have a group called the Hoitzan or the Kung. These people live in the Kalahari Desert of southern Africa. In the bottom picture, we have the Ache of Paraguay. The Ache live in dense tropical rainforest in areas that have been, up to this point, relatively untouched by kind of human modern, what's the word I'm looking for, kind of economic or commercial demands. We find that in modern times, foragers live in one of two kind of places. One of those places would be areas where the environment is unfavorable for food production. So the Kung live in the desert. Desert areas are are a lot harder to cultivate because they require more massive scale irrigation systems. And so we've got these foraging populations in southern Africa, like the Kung or the Hoitzan in the Kalahari Desert, persisting because that desert region is not overly productive in terms of actual food production. We have another area of Africa where foraging has been held onto, and that is in the equatorial forest region. So we're talking about like the Central African Republic, the Democratic Republic of the Congo. We're talking about dense tropical rainforests kind of in Central Africa from coast to coast. And so this includes populations like the Mbuti, the Efe. Many of these populations are referred to as pygmy populations. That really comes about because these populations are uniquely adapted for dense tropical rainforest life. And it just happens that when you live in the dense tropical rainforest, you kind of have a max height that people will be. So, just for example, the Ache are also well adapted to dense tropical rainforest life, and the average height for adult males among the Ache is only about 5'4". We compare that to a pastoral population in Kenya with the Maasai, where the average height for males is about 6'4". So this is why the populations in these equatorial forest regions are often referred to as pygmy populations. We've got, and the reason that these persist in dense tropical rainforested areas is because those areas don't have roads or access. They haven't really been opened up to commercial prospects and such. We have a thriving, though threatened, foraging group of foraging groups in Australia, those that we collectively refer to as Australian Aborigines. Australia has a very long history, 60,000 years or more, of life in this foraging lifestyle. And we'll use a film next week as we talk about foraging and the correlates of it that looks specifically at one of these Australian Aboriginal populations. So, no contact, no development of food production for about 60,000 years. It wasn't until Australia became a penal colony for the British that that food production was brought to that continent. And when you look at the environment of Australia, there's vast areas of desert. So I mean, the outback is traditionally thought of as kind of wild and untamed, but in a way that is coupled with really high aridity. In North America, we retained foraging among Arctic populations, specifically looking at the Inuit, the Tlingit, and others. These are populations where, again, foraging or the transition to food production doesn't really make sense when we think about the Arctic, for example, right? How much plant material are you going to be able to grow for the bulk of the year up within like the Arctic Circle? Well, the answer is none, right? When we talk about these areas that are permanently covered in ice, i.e., permafrost, right? We're talking about areas where you can't really commit to agriculture. That's not to say that everywhere in Canada and Alaska is not capable of being cultivated. And obviously, we're seeing some changes with climate change that may change the picture for some of these Arctic populations. But the Arctic is traditionally an area where it's really, really, really hard to farm. And then in South America, we have groups like the Ache of Paraguay. This idea of indigenous populations in dense tropical rainforest really also describes the plight of almost every Amazonian group that's left out there, right? There have been major pressures that have led to both massive die-off as well as relocation and settlement of Amazonian indigenous populations. And these are really being driven by governmental policy that favors commercial ventures over the traditions of its native peoples. When we look at some of the decisions being made by FUNAI, which is the group that's supposed to protect indigenous populations in the Brazilian Amazon, for example. Uh, there are concessions being made for logging, mining, etc., that are decimating the foraging populations that still live within the Amazon. So these include the Awa, these include the Yanomamo, these include a wide variety of traditional populations. There are, for example, several hundred indigenous populations in the Amazon of Brazil and um, in Colombia and Peru and such that are facing cultural extinction, what we would call ethnocide, basically, the loss of their traditional cultural practices. Not to mention COVID. COVID is similarly decimating Brazilian populations right now. All right, so modern foragers live in poverty by the basis of governmental calculations. So when we look at economic stratification the world over, right, we talked about how states are characterized by this highly stratified society that uses some sort of arbitrary designation or currency, right? When we talk about those people that fall kind of at the lowest at the of the low, those who are poorer than poor, almost all of these are hunter-gatherers that have been settled into communities dependent on food aid and government handouts. So in India, if we talk about the untouchables, for example, those are ex-foragers. When we talk about who in the United States lives at or below the poverty line, we find that um, our native populations I mean, make up a much larger proportional um, part of the population of people living in poverty, right? It's native populations and it's other communities of culture. So the reason why this happens is that hunter-gatherers, when we talk about how they conceptualize wealth, right? What are you going to amass as far as resources go in a hunter-gathering context, right? Hunter-gatherers, what are they going to save? What are they going to carry with them? Well, it's not going to be heavy things that are in like really high demand, right? We're not going to have like fine artworks and pottery and such. We're not going to have ceramics that we carry around with us. We're not going to have large amounts of wealth that we have to relocate every time we move because we need to be able to move everything really quickly. That mobility, both in terms of where you are in your territory, as well as where you are kind of in the status hierarchy, those are hallmarks of foraging populations. And so, in order to have high mobility, you're not going to have a lot of stored resources. You're not going to carry a lot of belongings with you. You need to be able to relocate pretty quickly and without too much energetic expenditure. All right, so when we look at where relatively recent populations of foragers have lived, right, we find these Arctic areas like the polar Inuit. We find groups in northern Siberia as well that are closely related to these groups that are also in the New World. We've got foraging persisting in the interior of Australia. We've got this equatorial region across Africa. We've got the southern Kalahari Desert. Um, in South America, we've got mostly forested regions, right? We've got multiple groups that are here in Brazil, in Peru, in Venezuela, etc. We've got the Ache in Paraguay. We've got some groups down in like southern Argentina and Chile. And then when we look at North America, in terms of relatively recent hunter-gatherer populations, most of North America kind of falls under this umbrella because it wasn't really until colonists came and conquerors came that we started to see the erasure and the resettlement of uh, Native American populations. So, particularly across the West, across the California coast, one of the reasons why these areas had not developed food production, I mean, it's kind of twofold. One, as we've already talked about, food production emerged at a very different pace in the New World than the Old World, partly because we had a lot larger genetic changes that we had to breed to turn teosinte into corn, and partly because we didn't have that same suite of mammals, that large-bodied mammals that we were able to domesticate, right? Those megafauna we hunted to extinction. The second factor, though, is that you've got to be motivated to make a change, right? And one of the reasons why foraging is still widespread throughout tropical regions is because these are regions with incredible species biodiversity, to the point where there are literally hundreds of different species of both plants and animals that foraging groups can use in their diet. And so this kind of species richness means that foraging can hang on without really it taking a lot of work. And, you know, we talked, as we were talking about the emergence of agriculture, we talked about how agriculture requires quite a bump up in terms of kind of work requirements, in terms of production tasks, right? The benefit of agriculture is not that it produces larger yields per unit work, right? It doesn't. Foraging is much higher yield per hour spent foraging. It's that what agriculture does is allows us to have more predictable yield. So we don't go through these cycles of feast and famine. In areas where there's a lot of species richness, why on earth would you make a shift to agriculture? If it's not hard to make a living because there's so many resources around you. This is really what's going on in Northern California and on up through the Pacific coast in Oregon, Washington, British Columbia, etc. Okay, that these areas were incredibly rich, not only in terrestrial resources. I mean, those areas are a temperate rainforest with a lot of plants that are endemic to those areas. And because there's a lot of plant life, you also get deer, elk, moose, etc. Right? But also, then we've got this these marine resources. And so these are areas, you know, from the California kelp forest north, these are areas that are incredibly rich with marine life. And that is because these are areas that have upwellings of colder water, like these currents that rise up from deeper in the ocean that bring with them a lot of plankton. And so there are a lot of then plankton feeders that utilize these areas. And when you think about the body size of some of these plankton feeders, think about baleen whales, right? Baleen whales are the ones that are filter feeders that have that comb through which the plankton will be strained. right? These are your large body whales. These are blue whales, these are humpback whales, etc. And we also, I mean, it's going to lead to an increase in fish populations as well, which means you're also going to have toothed whales that follow. So, a lot of whale populations breed off the coast of the Pacific Northwest, for example. These are areas that if you travel out as a tourist, you can go on whale watching expeditions, etc. So, if you've got both forest resources and marine resources that you can capitalize upon. There's no push in the direction of the development of farming. And so, really, we didn't see a shift away from foraging in the Pacific Northwest until 1849. Anybody know what happened in 1849? If you recall back to your US history classes, that was the California Gold Rush. And it was that first time, really, that white people made it out to the Pacific Northwest and brought with them kind of white standards, Eurocentric kind of cultural features and weaponry, of course. And it's that weaponry that decimated these native populations, that and the disease. All right. So, foragers, it's how we've lived for most of our lives. What are some of these correlates of foraging? Well, first of all, when we're talking about a correlate or a correlation, we're talking about an association or what we call covariation between two or more variables. Typically, foraging groups are mobile and flexible. They are mobile both in terms of where they are geospatially, but they also possess a high degree of what we would call status mobility. They have open status systems where there's vertical mobility, where you can be of higher esteem or lower esteem, where you have some control over your relative social status. People who subsist by hunting, gathering, and fishing often live in a type of political typology called band level or band organized societies. The band is the basic social unit among foraging populations. It generally has fewer than 100 people. It may split seasonally. We often find that foraging populations are what we call fission fusion organization, meaning that there are certainly times of the year where they come together in large numbers, maybe an entire even meta population, let's say 800 or more. But there are also times of year where their groups are relatively small. And so during other seasons of the year, we may be talking about only 50 people max. So that fission fusion organization is very characteristic of um, or kind of driven by the seasonality of your resources, right? And so there are um, there are a lot of let's say hypotheses out there about some of the things that we as humans are capable of based on our evolutionary history in band level societies. One of those things, Robin Dunbar, who's a primatologist in the UK, has been quoted as saying that that we need like roughly 150 friends or whatever. He was misquoted as saying that actually, and that we had just heard that we were listening to Malcolm Gladwell. He's a sociologist. His most recent book, Talking to Strangers, and he misquoted Dunbar's study. So Dunbar's study actually shows us that the maximum number of people that we are able to keep track of in terms of dyadic or two-party um, interactions is about 150 200 individuals. And so what this shows us is that when we get into group sizes larger than this, even before we innovate like state level political systems and such, right? That natural populations that reach above about 200 fission into two smaller daughter groups. And this is what we see among villages of like tropical horticulturalists, for example, that the village size tops out at about 150, 200 individuals. And this is also about what foraging populations are able to keep track of. You can keep track of the relationships and all of the interactions between about 150, 200 individuals. And so this is why foraging bands typically are smaller than that. Because any larger than that, it gets more complex. When we look at large scale societies, where we have group sizes that are much larger than 150, we do that through the innovation of cultural features such as laws, right? Where we have rules that are enforced by a branch of the government that we are expected to follow. We do find among foraging populations across the world, we find a sex based division of labor. We could argue that that is also a gender based division of labor. One thing I want you to keep in mind is that sex and gender are two separate things. Sex is rooted in biology, gender is rooted in really, I mean, has roots in biology, but is more of a psychological context where it's how you perceive yourselves and what roles society subscribes or kind of dictates for the sexes. So this division of labor is one where basically males specialize in producing things that have large package sizes that come with a big caloric bang. So most of the hunting that is done in human societies is done by males. That doesn't mean that males are always the hunters, though. It's tied into the fact that females are more likely to pursue labor tasks that can be interrupted or can be compatible with childcare. Because by and large, the world over, in traditional populations as well as modern ones, the burden of childcare falls on the shoulders of women. So, hunting in many cases is hard to balance with active childcare, which is why more often than not, we find that the hunters of any population are actually going to be male. The females then are going to focus on gathering, cooking, childcare, etc. We find in foraging groups, we find age-based social distinctions. Old people are frequently respected for their special knowledge of both ritual and practical matters, particularly when it comes to like events that are exceedingly rare, like rare climatic events, rare droughts, rare contact with neighboring people, rare kind of population cycles, right? The older people are generally the keepers of the wisdom, right? They tell the stories, they remember the stories, they transmit the stories through telling them to younger generations. That is true to a point, however. And interestingly, depending on the cultural features, the ecological features of different foraging populations, when we talk about really aged individuals, we see a variety of treatments. So the Ache in Paraguay are an interesting case in point. You are revered for your knowledge when you're old, but that's talking on the span of about 60 to 70 years of age. Once the Ache, before they were settled into reservations, once they reached about the age of 80, that's where they started to reduce their overall production. They weren't able to support themselves anymore. And so prior to being settled into reservations, because the Ache were contacted and settled in 1979. So we're talking about a relatively recent date of contact. I mean, I was already alive by then. So when the Ache were settled into reservations, at the point immediately prior, once you were above about the age of 80, one of two things happened to you. If you were female, they'd hit you over the head from behind and leave you for dead. If you were male, they would point you in the direction of the nearest village and tell you to keep walking, which oftentimes was also a death sentence, but they didn't outright kill their esteemed males. So, just an interesting little anecdotal bit of information there that esteem of the elderly only goes so far, only goes to a point beyond which they're not diminishing the rest of the group's ability to take care of themselves. All right, so most foraging people are relatively what we call egalitarian. That means relatively equal in status. There are some age-based distinctions, there are some sex-based distinctions. However, most adults are relatively equal in status. These contrasts are minor and based on age and gender.